In AD 165 and also in AD 251, there was a smallpox epidemic across the Roman world that wiped out a third of the Roman population, or the population of the Roman Empire. It was said apparently that on every single day in Rome alone, 5,000 people were dying because of this smallpox thing. And it sent sheer panic and terror throughout the Roman Empire. And essentially what families did was, if they thought that someone was unwell, they would just drag them into the street and abandon them there to die. And so over time, these bodies and the stench just piled up. The streets were filled with death and dying. The society was traumatized and filled with fear. And people started to gather around pagan temples just looking for comfort or consolation or some answers to the problem of suffering, or just looking for some kind of moral leadership in that kind of environment. And when they knocked on the door, there was no one home, because the pagan priests had fled the cities and abandoned their people. Following those epidemics, there was an exponential rise in the number of people connecting with the church and coming to know Jesus and being baptized. And the reason for that was that as the pagan priests fled the city, the Christians were kind of running into the city. They were right there. And they were giving their lives and everything they had to serving those people in the perilous state that they were in. And in fact, it was said that if you knew a Christian, you were more likely to survive. Even the people who were recording history in those moments, albeit in a slightly more oldie-worldy way, they said, you've got to hand it to these Christians. They know how to love people. The point is, it's the responsibility of the church in every generation to hear God say to us, what about the others? What about those who don't have what you have? What about the poor? What about the people who don't know the Lord? And in every generation, the Bible speaks, doesn't it? And in every generation, Jesus says the same thing. He says, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And we hear Jesus in every generation say, whatever you did for the least of these, my brothers, you did it for me. And so every generation hears those words, and we have a responsibility to figure out, how do we respond to what Jesus says? And every generation is responsible for receiving and experiencing the overwhelming love of the Father, and then figuring out that actually God's love as a father is broken for the broken. You know, his love is overwhelming for the last and the least and the lost. And we have to do something with that. And then we need to experience the propulsion of the Spirit propelling us out into the world, beyond the walls of the church, always to reach out for one more. And honestly, I think that is what's happening in our church at the moment. That the voice of God is saying to us as a church, what about the others? What about those people who don't know me? What about those people who don't have what we have? What about those people who have been abandoned by everyone else in society? What will you do to respond to the needs of the others? And this is the second week in a 3-week series that we're doing called Spreading Life Together Phase 2. It's a very, very significant time for us as a church. And so first of all, I want to say, if you weren't here last week, and maybe you're at one of the sites or you're here, it's really, really important that you listen to last week's talk. And so that's available on iTunes, it's available from our website. And also, if you're the sort of person, like you need it on a cassette or on vinyl or something like that, we will do our best. Just contact the office, we'll do what we can to get you the message, because it's really important that you hear it if this is your church. You also need to make sure that you pick up one of these booklets and the pledge and prayer card that's inside it, because there's loads of information in there about what it is that we feel God's asking of us. So please, will you pick up one of those, pray through it, and get stuck in. We'd love you to do that. And then next week, we're going to have a gift day. And we're all going to ask God for a number. In fact, I've just thrown that away, and now I've realized I was going to hold it up. there's a card in here which has got lots of boxes on it and different things for you to pray for. But there's a box there that says, I will increase my current general giving by. And there's been a little bit of confusion about what it is you're supposed to put in that box. And so just to quickly explain, if you currently give £500 a month, then God bless you for doing that. If you currently, and then you think, no, the Lord is asking me to give £800 a month from now on, the number you put in that box is 300. Okay, we're getting good at maths, that's good. If you currently give nothing regularly and in a committed way to the life of our church, and you decide that God is asking you to give £1,000 a month, then the number you put in the box is 1,000. Very good. And so once you've filled in the box and all of that, it's important that you start or you amend your current standing order. If you already have a standing order going into our current account, then you need to just amend that to the new figure. And if you haven't got a standing order set up and you feel like God's asking you to do that, then you need to set one up. And the details of all of that are on this card. So hopefully that's made that clear. What we're going to do is we're going to, in every site, we're going to worship God as a site. The site pastor is going to preach in every site and kind of ground the vision into the local context. And then there's going to be a basket at the front, and people are going to come and they're going to put their pledge cards into the, don't fold them into 20 folds, because then that takes too long to unfold it, but just maybe fold it in half and stick it in the thing. That'd be fantastic. And then on Sunday night, all of those baskets are going to come in from around the Shire, and they're going to empty those baskets into the basket that we've got here. And then on Monday, Adrienne and the finance team are going to count up all of that, and then we'll announce the amount the following weekend. It's a really important moment for us. For some people, it'll mean increasing your giving from 0 to a number. And for other people, it'll just mean I've been giving sporadically, or shall we say spontaneously, for some time, and now it's about I'm going to give in a regular and committed way. For other people, maybe you've been giving in, let's be honest, a slightly tokenistic way. There's a token of my membership of the church, and now you're saying, no, actually, we're going to give in a more substantial way. And for other people, you've been giving in a really substantial way, and you're maybe going to give in, an even larger amount, which is just amazing. I just want to be clear, we're not asking anyone to give in a reckless way. In fact, we're asking people to do the precise opposite of being reckless. We're asking people to pray and then to give in a decided and deliberate way according to what they feel the Lord is asking them to give. Also just wanted to say, if you are somebody, you've been here, this is your second week in our church, and you're thinking, I knew it was probably one of those churches, like one of those churches where they talk about money all the time. I've been here 2 weeks. They've spoken about money half of the time. That's probably how this works. I just want to say, even though the Bible talks about money a lot, and probably we could talk about money every other week, we don't do that. It's actually once or twice a year. And so you can go back, listen to our podcast if you want to prove that to yourself. But we do think that this is a really, really important time in the life of our church. And so it just felt like the right moment to spend some time this morning looking at what does the Bible say about what we do with our money, and what does giving generously look like from the perspective of the Bible. And we're going to read from Romans chapter 15. And so if you've got your Bible with you, you might just want to turn to that. And what we're going to see is we're going to see the Apostle Paul telling the Romans from his base in Corinth what his travel plans are for the next little while. So let's read from verse 20. He says, it's always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ was not known. I love that. So that I would not be building on someone else's foundation. Rather, as it's written, those who are not told about him will see, and those who have not heard will understand. This is why I have often been hindered from coming to you. But now that there is no more place for me to work in these regions, and since I've been longing for many years to visit you, I plan to do so when I go to Spain. I hope to see you while passing through and to have you assist me on my journey there after I have enjoyed your company for a while. Now, however, I'm on my way to Jerusalem in the service of the Lord's people there. For Macedonia and Achaia were pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the Lord's people in Jerusalem. They were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have shared in the Jews' spiritual blessings, they owe it to the Jews to share with them their material blessings. So after I have completed this task and have made sure that they have received this contribution, I will go to Spain and visit you on the way. I know that when I come to you, I will come in the full measure of the blessing of Christ. I urge you, brothers and sisters, by our Lord Jesus Christ and by the love of the Spirit, to join me in my struggle by praying to God for me. Pray that I may be kept safe from the unbelievers in Judea, and that the contribution I take to Jerusalem may be favorably received by the Lord's people there, so that I may come to you with joy by God's will, and in your company be refreshed. The God of peace be with you all. Amen. So you would be forgiven for thinking, well, this is like, Paul's giving some historical information. It's interesting biographical information about his travel plans and all that. It helps to place the teaching of Romans in the timeline of his life. But what actually is this saying really all about money? And I think the answer to that is that he understands that there is lots of money in the world, but that some of it is in the hands of God's people. I don't know how much money there is in the world. I'm sure somebody here does, or somebody in one of the sites knows. I'm guessing it's like trillions, or what comes after trillions? Quadrillions? Quintillions? I don't know. Anyway, there's a lot of money in the world, and people use their money in all kinds of different ways, don't they? So this week, if you had $5.9 billion, you could have bought Candy Crush. Yeah, and not just a little app, that's significantly cheaper, but the whole company. And in fact, because none of you bought it, the people who make Call of Duty and World of Warcraft, they bought Candy Crush instead. And so goodness only knows what Candy Crush Saga will look like in the next generation. I also saw a little TV thing this week about people who are preparing their lives for doomsday. I don't know whether anyone else saw it. They are spending their money, as much money as they can, buying all the things that will be required on the day of judgment. And so apparently the one key thing you need, and I don't know exactly why, is a canoe. If you've got a canoe, then you'll be more safe than others when it comes to the judgment of God. I don't know how that works. However, Paul understands that with all the money in the world, there's a proportion of it, a chunk of it, that rests in the hands of God's people. And he has a vision for that money. And that's why I've called this talk, I think, the bit that's in our hands. What is Paul's vision, his understanding of the bit that's in our hands? The first thing is we're called to give our money towards gospel mission. Verse 20, he says, it's always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ was not known. I mean, that's a fantastic vision. In fact, we could have taken that verse and used that as the sort of strap line for our vision, couldn't we? We want to preach the gospel. We want to introduce as many people as possible to Jesus, especially when no one else is doing that. He goes on to say, verse 21, that those who are not told about him will see, and those who have not heard will understand. And then he explains what that actually looks like in verse 24. He says, I plan to go to Spain, and I hope to see you while passing through, that you will assist me on my journey there. So Paul has preached the gospel in the whole of Asia Minor. He's gone as far north as Albania, which at that point was called Illyricum. And he's exhausted every strategic port and city in the whole of Asia Minor. And he's saying, and now I know that I have to go somewhere where the gospel hasn't been preached, where there are no churches that have been planted, where no one knows about Jesus. I've got to keep moving and finding fresh ground. And so I'm going to go on up to Spain and push on up into Europe. And he says, as I travel along that journey, trying to find fresh places for the gospel, I'm going to stop by you so that you can assist me, is his word, assist me. And if anyone's in any doubt, what he actually means is I'm going to stop off with you so that you can cough up, so that you can pay money, so that will help me on my way. The word that is used there, translated as assist, is the Greek word propempo. And it means literally to equip or to furnish or to provide the resources required for a journey. He's saying, I'm going to stop off with you on my way to plant churches and to preach the gospel all over Spain and up into Europe. And you are going to provide the resources required for that to happen. And he's not in the slightest bit awkward about saying that, is he? There's no, hope you don't mind, but just wondering whether you might see your way clear, governor, to giving me some money. It's not that. It's I'm going to come to you and you're going to assist me as I go. Why is that? It's because he understands that the resources for God's mission lay in the hands of God's people. The reality is that mission has always costed money. You can't share the gospel with tens of thousands of people with thin air and a prayer. I was reading this week about the amazing ministry of George Whitefield and John Wesley. And really they were the catalyst for, first of all, the evangelical awakening in the mid-18th century in the UK. And then, which then sparked the Great Awakening in America under Jonathan Edwards. Hundreds of thousands of people came to faith as a result of something that began with Wesley and Whitefield. But their ministry that affected hundreds of thousands of people was supported by a lady called the Countess of Huntingdon. And supposedly she gave, in today's money, about £14 million to resource the church planting and gospel preaching mission of those guys around the UK, which then had this effect around the world. She wasn't just throwing her money away. She wasn't just going, oh, well, I don't really need all of this money, so perhaps you can have some of it. She was investing it. And she was expecting a return for her investment in the preaching of the gospel to as many people as possible, and lots of people coming home to God. You may have read the book, The Heavenly Man, Brother Yun, this amazing Chinese saint who over decades was severely persecuted, imprisoned, tortured, separated from his family for decades in China. Extraordinary guy, seen loads and loads of people come to know the Lord. I think he's been exiled now. He's not allowed back into China by the Chinese government. But he said this. He said, I miss the offerings we used to give in China. Anyone miss the offerings? I miss the offerings we used to give in China. On numerous occasions, the leader of the meeting would announce, we have a new worker leaving tomorrow to serve the Lord. Immediately, every single person would empty their pockets of everything they had, and with that money, the worker would buy a train ticket or a bus ticket and leave the next day for his gospel ministry. Often, this money we gave was not just everything we had in our pockets, it was everything we had. So I miss those days. They gave sacrificially to sow into the planting of churches, the preaching of the gospel, the sharing of what they had with people who didn't have what they had. Paul says, I'm coming to you in order that I may be furnished with everything I need to take the gospel up into Spain and then on into Europe. The point is, if we want to see thousands and thousands of lost sheep meet their shepherd, and if we want to see thousands and thousands of prodigal sons coming home to their father to discover that he's already running towards them, it won't be free. You're very hard pressed in the whole of history to find a great awakening or a revival that didn't cost God's people money. And so we have to give our money towards the sharing of the gospel with people who don't know the Lord Jesus. Secondly, we're called to give our money to provide for the poor. Verse 25. Before I come to you, I'm on my way to Jerusalem in the service of the Lord's people there. For Macedonia and Achaia were pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the Lord's people in Jerusalem. One of the great works of the Apostle Paul's life was this collecting from all of the churches that he was relating to, asking them for money that he could then take and give to the starving poor in the city of Jerusalem. And in fact, some scholars think that he may well have done several offerings over the course of his lifetime. Just keep taking money from these guys and saying, let's all give this to people who really need it, to people who have nothing, to people who are starving. And these were people who were giving to other believers that they would distribute it. People they'd never met before, people they didn't know, but people who they recognized needed the money that they had. It was like they could say, well, somebody else's need is my obligation. And so I must share the resources that I have. Simon Ponsonby, who you all know, I'm a big fan, he said this: throughout Scripture, remembering the poor indicates walking with God. And you see that throughout the pages of Scripture, in the Old Testament law even. You know, some of those bits that we really love reading late at night. There are these bits where God says, I want my people to be different from everyone else. Because everyone else just harvests every grain of wheat on the field. But my people won't do that. They're going to just reap in the middle of the field, and then they're going to leave around the edge completely unharvested, so that then people who have nothing, they can come, and maybe they might come under the cover of darkness because they're embarrassed or feel awkward, but they can come and help themselves to your resources. The Old Testament prophets, often when you get to the heart of the issue, when they're bringing a rebuke to the people of God, when you get to the heart of it, it was, you are neglecting the poor and you're in rebellion against God. Jesus often reserved his most cutting criticism for people who didn't do it for the least of these, my brothers. And of course, in the book of Acts, you see immediately they understand. We're now the church, we're now God's people, and we have to share our resources. And you see them selling fields and giving the money to the apostles, and the apostles distribute to anyone who had need. And it actually says there were no needy people among them because everyone was sharing the resources that they had. If you're giving your money away, and I really hope you are, if you're giving a chunk of your money away, please will you make sure that some of your money finds its way to people who don't have what you have. That's why Taryn and I, we have always, since we've been married, given away a proportion of our income. And you know how over the years the proportions that you give to different things kind of change, and so I don't know, over time you accumulate, you see a TV advert for Save the Children or something, and could you give £5 a month? You think, I could give £5 a month. Yes, I could. So, you accumulate all these different things that you give money to. But over time, we've ended up kind of readjusting and recalibrating our giving. And we've ended up in a position where we give the overwhelming majority of what we give to the ministry of this church, because we know where it goes. And we know that this is a church that's being multiplied out and is serving the poor. It's the kind of church that is saying, if you are choosing between heating your house and putting food on the table, or if you are prostituting yourself because you're desperate, or because you are lonely, or you've been abandoned, or because you're helpless, or because society has pushed you to the edges, we want to include you. You're welcome here. You can find a home in our midst, and we will help you. And that's right at the core of our DNA, and it will always be that. And whatever churches we plant and whatever sites we send out, if they don't honor the poor and serve the poor, they're not having our money. We've also arrived at a position as a church where we give away thousands and thousands of pounds all over the world. And, Taryn and I have been to Nairobi, and we've seen how New Life Homes rescue babies who've been abandoned in carrier bags, umbilical cords still attached, and give them dignity and a new life. I've been to Cambodia, and I've seen how the guys there are providing employment opportunities for people so that they're safe from human trafficking and all kinds of slavery. And we know Susan Wilson and the work that she's doing in Tanzania, and some of you guys have been there. And you know, we know Tony and Liz and the work that they started in Albania, giving a home to people who nobody else wants to give a home to. We know where this money goes. And one of the greatest joys about this whole journey that we're on is if we all do give in the way that we're hoping that we will all give, then we will be giving over £100,000 a year to rescue abandoned babies left in carrier bags and so on. We must make sure that our money always finds its way to the poor. And honestly, I believe giving to the local church is a really great way to do that. The Apostle Paul says in Galatians 2 verse 10, he says, all the apostles asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I had been eager to do all along. We must give to the poor. Thirdly, we are called to give according to the voice of the Spirit. Now, lots of us give to all kinds of causes for all kinds of motives and reasons, don't we? I was thinking the other day about, is he Sir Bob Geldof? I think he might be Sir Bob, is he? Yeah. Anyway, you know what I mean. He was watching that TV documentary, or the news at 10. Michael Burke was in Ethiopia, walking around the aid camps and seeing these children starving to death. And his response was, we have to do something about that. And often we see situations where we think, I could give money to that and my money would make a difference. That's a really great reason. But we give for all kinds of reasons. And I think one of the reasons as God's people that we must give is because God, by his Spirit, tells us to. And actually that's what you see happening in this passage. The Macedonians and all of those guys, they weren't giving because they'd heard, you know, via the 10 o'clock news that there was a famine in Jerusalem. In fact, they were giving even before the famine even started, because God, by his Spirit, had already told his people that a famine was coming. You see that in Acts chapter 11. The Apostle Paul, who at that point is still called Saul, he's with Barnabas in Antioch. And it says in verse 27, during this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and through the Spirit predicted that a severe famine would spread over the entire Roman world. The disciples, as each one was able, decided to provide help for the brothers and sisters living in Judea. This they did, sending their gift to the elders by Barnabas and Saul. So I think the principle of this situation is that God's people, we hear the voice of the Spirit. And as a community of faith, we weigh the prophetic word and we consider, is this the Lord? And if it is, then we make a decision, which is the word there, they decided, we make a decision to respond to the word of God by giving financially. And so I think that's a similar process to where we're at right now. You know, we've been living with this fresh sense of vision for the last few months. And you know, we first of all began to talk about it in our leadership team meetings. And whenever we did, it was like, oh, and there's the Spirit of God. It's just a lovely sense of God's presence. And so we were pretty convinced that was what God was saying. And so there came a point where I had to bring that stuff to the trustees of the church and say, guys, what do you think about the finances of all of this? And you know, a little bit nervous, if I'm honest, just thinking, you know, their job is to be conservative and to, you know, really check the numbers and the facts and all of that stuff. And so it was the right thing, it would be the right thing for them to be, you know, a position of slight skepticism. But actually, again, as I shared it, there was God in the room. And a miracle happened in that room. The trustees said, this is very exciting. That is a miracle. That's like the Spirit of God, you know. They were like jumping up and down, and not quite, but they used the word exciting, so that is good in itself. And then we started to share it with, you know, pastors and the staff team and the leaders of the church, and then we shared it across the whole church last Sunday. And each time, I think there's just been a lovely sense that God's affirming that internally in each one of us. Alongside that, there are numerous prophetic words coming from within our church and also out with our church. So we had an email this week from another pastor in the city saying, I've been praying for you as a church, and I feel like the Lord's given the word urgency to you as a church. And again, there's that situation where God isn't just speaking to us as a church, he's speaking to churches all over the nation and saying the same thing. And so what I'm not saying is, do you find what I'm saying compelling? I'm not saying, have I used my Jedi mind tricks on you to sufficient levels that you're going to raid your piggy banks? That's not what I'm saying. I'm actually saying something much more serious than that, which is, do you think this is the Lord? It's much more serious. And if you do, what is your response? And so we're asking you to weigh what we're saying we think God might be saying, and then to respond according to what is the Spirit of God saying to you individually and as a family and as a household and all of that. Fourthly, we're called to give our money sacrificially. Paul says twice in verse 26 and also in verse 27 that the Macedonians were pleased to give. What he doesn't say in this passage is that they were giving from a place of having absolutely nothing. He says that in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. He describes their situation, the Macedonian churches, as being extreme poverty. How did they manage to give so generously when they had almost nothing, when they were scraping the bottom of an empty barrel? The only answer that I can think of is that they took Jesus seriously when he said, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself. The way of the cross is the way of self-denial, of sacrifice. Around the 4th and 5th centuries, there was a movement called asceticism, where people took that self-denial thing really seriously, and they did all kinds of terrible things to mutilate their own bodies, which honestly you don't want any of the detail of that, just because I want to deny myself. And there was one guy, Simon Stylites. He went up a pole 4 meters up in the air, and he stayed on a meter-wide platform 4 meters up in the air for 39 years. I mean, that's just nuts, isn't it? That's completely potty. I don't recommend that any of us do that. In fact, please don't do that. The reason it's nuts is because it's self-denial, it's sacrifice for no purpose whatsoever. It's a whole different ballgame when God's people sacrifice their own comfort for the purposes of God. The truth is, if we can give to all kinds of charities and mission organizations, and we can give regularly to the life of the church, and our lifestyles are completely unaffected, then there's something wrong. So each of us over the next little while has to ask God, what would you have me sacrifice? What would you have me go without? How would you have this affect my lifestyle? And for some of us, to have our lifestyle significantly affected, it's going to mean not just giving 10%, but giving many multiples of 10% of our income away, until finally we're at a place where, wow, this is actually biting really significantly on my lifestyle. Let me just speak directly to a few groups of people across our church. First of all, I know lots of students are away at the CU Weekend Away this weekend, but if you're a student, lots of people would say, well, I'm a student, or I've got a very low income. To be honest, whether I give my money or not, you're not even going to notice because it's such a small amount of money. And to which I say to you, that is completely not the point. Jesus saw this little old lady, hobble up to it doesn't say hobble up, but she went up to the temple treasury and she dropped 2 little copper coins, 2 tiny shavings of copper into the box there. And Jesus said, she has given more than anyone else. And if you're, on a very low income, please don't feel like you're being excluded from the journey that we're on as a church. In fact, I think you could easily include yourself. So for example, If you said, well, I'm going to go without a latte and a pint of beer every week for the time I'm at university. So normally I would get a latte on a Tuesday morning and a pint of beer on a Friday night. I'm going to go without those, maybe a $5 a week, optimistically. And I'm going to give a $5 a week to this thing. $5 a week, £260 a year. Over the course of a 4-year university course, over £1,000. Do you know you would pay, we give away Bibles every week across all of our sites. We put the Word of God into the hands of people who've never had a Bible before. Do you know the statistics came out recently? 64% of Scots have never read the Bible. And your £1,000 would pay for all of the Bibles across all of the sites for a whole year. Hundreds of Bibles. And you could find loads of other things that your money would go towards. Please don't exclude yourself. Ask the Lord, what could I go without in order to give? Secondly, young adults. Our accountant tells us that if you're under the age of 30 in our church, you're really unlikely to be giving at the moment. And that breaks my heart. And the truth is that probably at the moment you're thinking, well, I'm just setting myself up on my journey. I've got expenses and things to pay for. I've got to buy stuff for my flat or whatever it is. But the truth is that then you'll be saving up the deposit for a house, and then you'll be buying a car, and then perhaps a family will come along and you'll be supporting your family. And the later you start, the harder it is. And so as your pastor, I just want to say, for goodness sake, start now. Don't wait, because the more money you've got, the more money you spend, the harder it is to start. And lots of people join our church having become Christians later on in life. They discover this whole journey, age 40, 50, 60, and the amount of money then that God is asking them to give is a big chunk that they're not used to having given. If you start when you've got almost nothing, it will be something that you never miss for the rest of your life. And lastly, let me say, if you are someone who has an above average income, either here or in one of the other sites, just as I've been praying about this whole thing and really just saying, Lord, please help me, because again, this might be a P45 moment. It may be that you look at that £11,500 a month chunk and you think, do you know what, I could actually take a really big bite out of that myself. And we would just encourage you to do that. If anyone in our church wants more details about where all the money goes, you are welcome. We're transparent in all of our financial things. Please just ask if you need more information to steady things up. But we would just encourage you to give sacrificially as the Lord would ask you. Finally, we're called to give our money and receive joy along the way. To be honest, it doesn't sound fun, does it? I'm going to go without lattes and beer and Sky TV and takeaways, and I'm not going to get that new car, and I'm not going to renovate my kitchen. And, it sounds miserable, doesn't it? And you might expect that in a few weeks' time, when all of our new standing orders kick in, that we'd all be coming here commiserating at how miserable we all are. Wasn't much fun this week, was it? Did you miss the lattes? Yeah. No beer on Friday night? No. I can promise you, it will not be like that. In fact, the very reverse will be true. Everything that we celebrate in our church and beyond that God is doing, we'll be saying, it's brilliant, isn't it? Didn't need that latte, did we? I read earlier on from 2 Corinthians chapter 8, the Macedonians, it says that when they gave, they experienced overflowing joy. And actually that is the result of generosity in our lives. You would think that a person who's decided to hold on to the most stuff would be the happiest. The person who has the most possessions and the comfiest life would be the happiest. But if that were true, then the wealthiest people in the world would also be the happiest people in the world. And we know that that's not true. In fact, the happiest people in the world are the people who've loosened their grip on what they have and who've found that giving away our resources brings tremendous joy. You see it here in Romans chapter 15 that I was reading earlier on. Verse 29, he says that after he drops off this gift for the poor in Jerusalem, to be distributed amongst the poor, he says, I will come to you in the full measure of the blessing of Christ. What on earth does that mean? The full measure of the blessing of Christ. I think it hints at it actually in verse 32 when he says, I'll come to you with joy. What he means is, I will have gone round all of these churches for years, and I would have collected all of this money from all of these brothers and sisters from around the known world, and I'm going to bring it, the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of pounds, and I'm going to give it to the church in Jerusalem, and their faces are just going to be like, wow, that's so amazing, and they're going to have such fun distributing that all amongst the poor across the whole region of Judea. And he said, I'm going to come away from there, and I promise you, I will be buzzing. He's like, you're going to have to scrape me off the ceiling because I will be exploding with joy. I can't imagine what that must be like, to spend your whole life collecting for the poor and then to give it away. It's an adventure. And this will not be a miserable adventure. It will be an adventure in joy. And let me just finish by saying this, and I know I've gone over time, but I just want you to know, and always wrestle with whether this is the right thing to share or not, but we just want you to know that Taryn and I are all in. Like, we're not asking you in Stonehaven or Ellen or Inverurie or here to do something that we're not committing to do ourselves. And the reason we're doing it is because we honestly believe it's the only appropriate response to the Spirit of God provoking this thing in the life of our church. And so please, don't feel under any pressure to give anything, but please will you ask God? Please will you pray about this pledge card thing? And please will you ask just God for a number to put in the box? Why don't we stand?